Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you for wherever you're joining us from today. My name's Sarah. I work at the EADI Secretariat in Bonn, Germany, and I'm thrilled to see all of you here today. Welcome to this distinguished guest lecture hosted by EADI. EADI is, if you're not already familiar with us, the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, and we work on improving the visibility of development studies throughout Europe and promoting cooperation between our members across countries. If you're interested in our events lineup, you can check out our website at eadi.org. This is our first distinguished guest lecture this year, and we're pleased to welcome Karen Coelho for a lecture on urban resettlement colonies in India, which is especially fitting for today as October 31st is UN World Cities Day. And to begin the talk, I will hand things over to our discussant for today, Dr. Maartje van Eerd, who will introduce herself and the speaker. Over to you, Maartje. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone to this guest lecture, which I'm very pleased to be asked to moderate, particularly since I know Karen already for a long time. I admire and am inspired by a lot by her work, and we have also collaborated in some projects in Chennai. So very pleased to be here. It's my great pleasure to now introduce to you Professor Karen Coelho. Karen recently retired as professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies in Chennai, India. She's an anthropologist and has researched the city of Chennai for over 2 decades, focusing on ethnographic examinations of urban infrastructure, informal settlements and resettlement schemes, and the eco-restoration of rivers, canals, and dikes. Karen is the co-editor of the book Participolis, Consent and Contention in Neoliberal Urban India, and has published numerous books and articles. She serves on the editorial advisory board of the Review of Urban Affairs of the Economic and Political Weekly of India, and is the editor with Urban Studies Journal. She was a member of the drafting committee for the Housing and Habitat Policy and the Housing Advisory Committee for the government of Tamil Nadu. Karen will talk about resettlement in India that is increasingly happening at the peripheries of cities. She will outline the new marginalities engendered by what she calls the strategy of inclusion, and she explores how the urban is remade in the countersides of metropolitan transformation. In today's session, I will be the discussant. My name is Maartje van Eerd. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies of Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and I conduct research and teach, amongst others, on resettlement, gender, and housing rights. A bit about the logistics of today. Karen will talk to us about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for the Q&A. You are invited to post your questions in the chat, which will be asked to Karen after her talk. You are welcome to do this yourself, but if you face problems with the connectivity or prefer me to ask the question, that's also perfectly fine. Then you just do not unmute. Or you can also already mention in the chat what your preference is. We'll keep an eye on the chat, and in case there are similar questions that can be clubbed together, I might try to do so. I hope you're happy with that, so we have sufficient time to discuss. And now, without further ado, Karen, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you. Just 1 second. I want to make sure that I'm sharing the slide. Hello, everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Sarah in particular, who's been after me and organized this, and Maartje, who's an old friend, and it's a real pleasure to be moderated by her. I am going to now try to share my screen. Okay, and where is my... Okay, can you see that, everybody? Yes, you can, right now? Okay.
Yes, but can you? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Good.
Is there a problem?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Yes. Hello, everybody. So yes, as I say, thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Maartje. I have been studying various aspects of resettlement colonies, specifically in Chennai, for over a decade now. And I've been looking at various aspects, employment, women's work, mobilities, social organization, flood vulnerability, and many of these in collaboration with scholars of resettlement in other parts of India and a couple of scholars from outside India, like South Africa. And I think what I want to trace in this talk is the making of a new marginality through particular modes of urban housing provision that are becoming dominant across India and actually many countries of the global South, and that are framed in terms of inclusion and formalization of informal and excluded urban populations. So while affordable housing provided, facilitated or subsidized by the state has long been seen as a key intervention in poverty alleviation, this lecture traces how such intervention can produce and reproduce marginalities and tries to analyze how and why that happens. So I'm talking about this new urban marginality. I'll start with this spread of images, which are all from actually different cities and different projects across India. And what you'll notice, I hope, is the sort of marked uniformity of sort of shoddy, multi-storied buildings, ranged in repetitive lines across vast tracts of land. These landscapes can be found off the corridors connecting India's metropolitan cities to their expanding peripheries. And these are known as resettlement colonies. They are projects of mass, that is very large scale, formal, that is state-built or state-sponsored, low-income housing that have emerged on metropolitan peripheries across the country over the past 2 decades. Importantly, they are located on lands of low economic value. That means flood-prone, hazardous, or polluted. And they house a concentration of vulnerable urban populations. So low caste, ethnic or religious minorities, informal workers, or migrants. So what I will argue in this talk is that these projects redefine the social geographies and the institutional practices of urban marginality. Resettlement, the definition, it's defined as a form of official compensatory assistance for the growing numbers of people that are displaced by development projects such as dams or highways. But here I'm discussing a specific kind of resettlement, the removal of property-less urban households en masse from cities to planned settlements on their peripheries in order to clear slums, also known as informal settlements, and ostensibly to improve the living conditions of their inhabitants. This form of resettlement has emerged as a dominant mode of urban restructuring in India since the 2000s, and it fulfills 2 imperatives of urban renewal. One, the urgent upscaling of low-income housing stock to meet the vast shortage identified by official studies. And second, the rehousing of slum dwellers that are now routinely evicted from cities for various infrastructure, transport, or ecological restoration projects, and increasingly for climate adaptation plans. So resettlement has thus become a development project in its own right. It aims to fulfill multiple urban governance objectives, including alleviating poverty through providing housing, formalizing informal settlements. This is seen as a key means of inclusion, integrating informal workers into formal markets, and disciplining them through new obligations of taxes, service fees, and the formation of resident associations to manage and maintain their neighborhoods. So as the dominant nationwide model of social housing, this model of sort of mass peripheral resettlement has replaced earlier, more integrative approaches to slum clearance. For example, in Chennai, the large metropolitan city in southeastern India, where I have done most of my research, it had in the 1980s implemented quite successful approaches of slum upgrading and sites and services, which have been found to have transformed the erstwhile slums into thriving and inclusive neighborhoods over a long sort of 30, 40-year time span. Such outcomes of slum upgrading have been documented and recognized even in other cities, like there's the famous Ahmedabad Slum Networking Project. Yet by the early 2000s, these approaches had largely been abandoned in Chennai, across the country, in favor of these mass tenement construction on the urban peripheries. So what then explains this national shift to this model? I identified three interlinked features. I mean, there's a lot of explanations, but just to be sort of brief and parsimonious, I'll say three features of what has been termed India's urban turn in the early 2000s. First, reframing Indian cities as engines of growth has pivoted on the financialization of urban land, leading to steep increases in land prices. Second, this urban turn has entrenched new regimes of what has been termed bourgeois environmentalism or aesthetic governance, referring to a convergence among elite civil society, state agencies, and corporations, business corporations, around agendas of sanitizing and beautifying cities, accompanied by a growing intolerance of slums and informal settlements in the city. And an important part of this is a focus on urban water bodies, which are now seen as both ecological and real estate assets for waterfront development and leisure infrastructure. Water body eco-restoration projects invariably target informal settlements that have historically grown on their banks as encroachers and polluters, and they ensure that they are evicted. So eco-restoration has emerged as a powerful catalyst of exclusion, unfortunately, in Indian cities. And all of these processes brought an end to 2 decades of squatter mobilization, housing rights struggles across India's major cities that were prominent in the 70s and 80s. You had a lot of sort of these struggles. So the mid-2000s saw slum eviction drives of unprecedented scale and ferocity across India's major cities, removing hundreds of thousands of households from the banks of the Sabarmati River in Ahmedabad, the Yamuna River in Delhi, the Miti River in Mumbai, and the Kuam River in Chennai. Varying proportions of evicted families were then sent to these resettlement colonies. Resettlement thus represents 2 convergent strands of urban restoration, that is, saving the water bodies, and the other of slum-free cities from slums. I just got a message that my internet connection is unstable. Is it okay? You can hear me? Yeah. And third, the launch of India's first national urban renewal mission in 2005 invigorated efforts to supply low-income housing at a rapid pace and scale in all big cities, enabled by large flows of central government funds under Housing for All and Slum-Free Cities missions. These schemes focused on constructing new stock in multi-story tenements, most of which were located on these low-priced lands on the urban peripheries. And this trend of peripheralization has only intensified with new generations of centrally funded housing projects. Now, these funding schemes have produced resettlement colonies as a supply-driven housing solution, where tens of thousands of tenements are constructed in anticipation of large-scale evictions from the city, which means that evictions are sort of the foundation of this kind of housing. So they fundamentally shape the experience of resettlement, offsetting the advantages of formal housing with serious losses of livelihoods, social networks, and mobility, and forcing families to rebuild their lives from scratch. So just to ground this story, I'm going to talk a little bit about the resettlement colony of Kanaginagar, located in the city of Chennai, which I have been studying for over 15 years. It was built, so if you see, this is Chennai. Can you see my cursor? Okay, this is Chennai on the southeastern coast. And then let me move the zoom thing so that, yeah. And if you see, this is Chennai. Now, this is the old city boundaries. This is the new city boundaries that were formed when the city was expanded in 2011. And you'll see Kanaginagar here outside of the old city boundaries. And then there are 2 more resettlement colonies out here, way on the edge of the metropolitan area. So Kanakinagar was built in the early 2000s in a large site about 25 kilometers from the city. It was originally built to accommodate about 15,000 families, and over the years, another 8,000 were added, making it one of the largest resettlement colonies of Chennai. It was built on a large stretch of marshland. And as I showed you later, 2 more resettlement colonies were located on that same marshland. So if you see this, this one on the right is an elevation map of Chennai, and the red is the lowest elevation. It's the great Palikarnai marshland, and you'll see Kanaginagar and the 2 other resettlement colonies all located right in there. This is a picture of the marsh here. So Kanaginagar houses families evicted from 90 different slums in the city. So it's a really massive spatial concentration of vulnerable low-caste people from different city neighborhoods, all squashed in there. About 10 years, over the years, it has improved quite a lot, actually, in terms of its infrastructure and facilities, largely due to people's struggles over the years. But when we first began working there, it was a destitute wasteland where people felt dumped and which had earned a reputation as a ghetto of poverty, crime, and squalor. That's just the sort of press coverage in those years when before things had improved. So as we studied various phenomena unfolding in this huge settlement, residents' livelihood struggles, mobility challenges, living conditions, and their disconnection from the city, we began finding strikingly similar findings in other resettlement colonies, both those that were being constructed in Chennai and also from other resettlement colonies across the country. So what I and other colleagues are trying to capture is the ways in which this form of urban resettlement constitutes a distinctive socio-spatial phenomenon unfolding across India and indeed, as I said, many countries of the global South. So in what follows, I will outline key commonalities in the character of these projects across Indian cities, drawing on studies from Delhi, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, and Chennai, to argue that despite goals of inclusion and formalization, these projects produce effects of peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection of residents from the urban mainstream. They are sites of structural violence that severely constrain residents' opportunities for socioeconomic advancement, and they reproduce marginalization, poverty, stigma, and threat. Yet, I also show that when viewed through extended timeframes of settling and remaking lives in these colonies, resettlement emerges as a highly anomalous process where formalization produces informalities of various kinds and where marginality is countered by residents' ongoing claims and assertions. And finally, I offer a conceptual framework for understanding urban peripheral resettlement as a specific form of inclusion, a highly slanted, compromised, incomplete form, which I am terming differential inclusion. This type of inclusion incorporates subaltern subjects into a tiered and unequal order. I use this concept along with another concept or another frame, that of indifference, to show how differential inclusion is held in place by everyday relations of indifference between state service providers and these beneficiaries of subsidized housing to maintain and reproduce the stigma of these places and these people. So resettlement colonies here, talk about them as a type. Studies of resettlement colonies across Indian cities highlight striking consistencies in their features, dynamics, and effects, despite differences in sizes, settings, and governance. Each settlement is thus a place, but also a type. I will elaborate on these 3 dynamics, peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection, that capture the effects of resettlement across different cities. But first, I want to sort of bound and specify this phenomenon, because urban resettlement is not new. Moving slum dwellers out of cities has been part of the strategies through which several Indian cities have tried to sanitize and renew themselves from the late 19th century by what were known as city improvement trusts, which comprised elite citizens and colonial administrators in these sort of in the early 20th century, late 19th century. But these early efforts were scattered and small scale. And of course, there was one notorious instance of large-scale evictions, which was the Indian emergency, that sort of very totalitarian event that happened in the 1970s, wherein over 700,000 slum dwellers were removed from Delhi during the emergency. But this, I argue, was a violent banishment rather than the formal rehousing that contemporary resettlement programs represent. So what marks the contemporary phenomenon then, I argue, is the combination of scale and policy intent. Urban resettlement in India today comprises 1, large scale, and 2, systematic and well-funded operations to rehouse informal settlers in planned and serviced sites with the intent of integrating them into mainstream agendas of urban renewal and world-class city making. So the policy framework of inclusion is thus a defining feature of this phenomenon, drawing from a global consensus that links tenure security and improved housing to poverty alleviation. And the key mode of inclusion here then is formalization, building on the idea that a fundamental problem of urban deprivation in cities of the global south is the informal status of slum dwellers, meaning that they lack formal tenure and rights to their housing, and thereby basic citizenship entitlements. So formalization here is aimed at giving residents a set of protections and promises, including a concrete house with entitlement to state-provided services and a new relationship with the state. So resettlement colonies then are presented as integrated townships with all amenities from water, sanitation, electricity, and roads to schools, child care, health facilities, and playgrounds. As part of a neoliberal paradigm of inclusion, they envisage the transformation of slum dwellers into citizen consumers by integrating them into municipal services and formal markets. However, findings on the ground reveal that resettlement has rarely, if ever, launched a simple pathway of advancement for its subjects. Instead, it has produced new complexes of disadvantage that have inhibited the physical and socioeconomic mobility of residents, blocked their integration into the urban mainstream, and created islands of exception or ghettos. Now, there are some important differences among resettlement colonies in India. While the majority comprise ready-built tenement housing, a few actually provide serviced plots that people can build on. And while most are built and managed by governments or states, we see a rising trend of private builders using incentives provided by sort of central government housing programs to construct housing colonies on cheap peripheral land for sale to low-income households. But neither of these differences significantly alters these key dynamics of peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection that I argue constitute the phenomenon as a specific mode of marginalization. So let me talk about these three things. First, peripheralization. Geographic peripheralization is a paradigmatic feature of urban resettlement. But peripheralization here is less a matter of physical distance from the city than about a relegation to lands of the lowest market value. Distances from the city may range from a few kilometers to over 40 to 50 kilometers, although distances are increasing with newer generations of these projects. But whether built by state or private agencies, these projects are sited on poor quality lands prone to flooding or abutting toxic facilities such as garbage dump yards or polluting industries. Zones that are marked as undesirable for ecological or economic reasons become hubs, attracting a clustering of such colonies. So in Chennai, as I showed you, the flood-prone marshlands on the southern edges of the city were taken over by the state and landfilled to build these three large resettlement colonies. In Delhi, colonies are clustered on the northwestern floodplains, which also host large garbage landfills. In Mumbai, again, marshy coastal floodplains that were marked as no development zones became a favorite zone for siting these resettlement tenements. Thus, the peripheralization of low-income housing is both rooted in and also contributes to a sort of a political ecology of differential value production in the city. So you're actually creating these low-valued, zones, but also plugging into them. Discrimination. Resettlement colonies across Indian states, tenement style or plot-based, state-built or private, reveal a consistently inferior standard of infrastructure and services, attracting terms like state-built slums or substandard settlements. Nearly all studies point to problems with size and design of tenements, especially in the early generations of projects. Kanaginagar's houses were between 160 to 180 square feet, less than half the recommended minimum size for low-income housing. Standardized designs yield cramped quarters that provide no spillover space to accommodate the expanded households and the multiple functions that constitute low-income housing. Now, while some of these aspects, like size and design, had improved in newer generations of resettlement colonies in Chennai, in response to widespread criticism of the earlier sites, the poor quality of construction was still evident in cracks in walls and ceilings, collapsing window bars, poor wiring, leaking pipes, and walls that emitted shocks during rains. And this was true in most resettlement tenements across the country, and some have even collapsed with tragic consequences. So these are stories from Delhi from last year. Even more common were stark inadequacies in basic services. People are often moved into these places before the infrastructure and services are completely in place. So the shock of evictions is exacerbated by being returned to conditions of less than basic amenities that they had struggled for years to overcome in the slums where they were staying. Many sites are not connected to the municipal water and sewerage networks and receive contaminated water supplies through mobile tankers. Sewage is held in septic tanks that are not regularly cleaned, so they cause overflows, stagnation, stench, mosquitoes. This narrative was repeated across colonies in every city. The 15,000 tenements in Chennai's Kanaginagar lacked formal electricity connections for over 10 years after they were established. Other services like schools, childcare centers, health centers, all of which were included in their plans, were either absent, insufficient, non-functional, or understaffed. In most cases, infrastructure and services were gradually improved over long periods of time. But for vulnerable households, these years of disconnection from basic services create serious ruptures with long-term repercussions on their trajectories of urban advancement. Now, the third dynamic, disconnection. Multiple forms of disconnection perpetuate or reproduce poverty and disadvantage in these sites. First, distance combined with poor transport disrupts livelihoods, which is the single most serious challenge faced by residents in every resettlement colony. And this is because resettled populations remain dependent on the city for work, education, healthcare, and social networks for several years after the move. And their constrained mobility is more a function of poor transport facilities than of distance. So across cities, residents reported insufficient bus routes, low bus frequencies resulting in overcrowding, unreliable services. Those who could use it used two-wheelers, but these options were predominantly available to men. For women, then, these mobility challenges added to the challenges of running households and poorly serviced sites caused large numbers to drop out of the workforce. So significantly low female workforce participation was found in all of the settlements across the country that we looked at. Even when resettlement colonies are located near industrial hubs, most residents cannot obtain work there, as they had worked as street vendors, domestic workers, or daily wage laborers in the city, and lacked the skills or network to access employment in these new sectors. Local jobs were also hard to get because of the stigma associated with these settlements. So almost all workers faced breaks ranging from a few months to several years in their occupational trajectories. Many households now survived on a single wage. Most had gone into debt, and many had to take their children out of school, both for logistical and financial reasons. So there was a lot of sort of even school dropout. And many residents experience this dislocation from the city as deurbanization. So in this settlement called Gudapakam, which you can see here, 50 kilometers from the city, people describe the move as being sent to a jungle or as being ruralized. Young people miss the cinema, internet centers, and markets. Women contrast the ease of movement that they had enjoyed in their city neighborhoods with present conditions where every trip required so much planning and expense that they simply opted to stay home. A third form of disconnection was the alienation of residents from processes of building homes and neighborhoods. So moving into fully built standardized housing units, being heavily dependent on the state for basic services, and the poor quality of these services undermined their sense of ownership and inhibited their participation in what Arjun Appadurai has called the production of locality. All resettlement colonies showed high rates of vacancy and turnover of housing units as people rented out or sold their allotments to return to the city. And safety, this emerged as the consistent concern across all resettlement colonies in all cities. This was like the most common thing that people talked about, especially women. Safety threats were multifaceted. So from poor lighting in corridors, compounds, and access roads, which made women and girls feel unsafe moving around after dark. There were also common accounts of theft and violent brawls that damaged buildings and vehicles. Alcohol and drug abuse, including among children, made women reluctant to let their children play unattended outside. High rates of child marriage were reported in Kanaginagar as parents saw this as a way to keep their daughters safe. And many families left their children in the city due to unsafe conditions in these colonies. Since houses were randomly located to people from different slums, neighbors were strangers, and mutual distrust into collective action hampered the transformation of these projects into viable sort of neighborhoods. So all of this suggests that despite the benefits of formalized tenure, the effects of resettlement can be characterized as a form of structural violence. Here I'm indexing both Galtung's definition of violence as a situation in which people are constrained from achieving their full potential, and Akhil Gupta's narrower definition that talks about outcomes of extreme suffering and deprivation. So structural violence, as you probably know, refers to violence that is impersonal, normalized, built into structures of power, and constant rather than episodic. Structural violence here then encompasses both the immediate impacts of shock, loss, and disconnection that displacement pervades, and its longer-term effects of curtailing the opportunities and the mobility of households. So I'm going to move to the next part of this talk, which is about remaking, remaking the urban. Residents have rarely resigned themselves passively to the object status of being resettled and have gone on to remake these places in different ways over time. Several studies have emphasized how the meanings and experiences of resettlement shift over time. Early experiences are shaped by the trauma of forced eviction, which leaves lasting scars on the household's ability to rebuild a life. But as the shock of displacement wanes and the settlements develop, residents shift their energies to rebuilding. In plot-based resettlement, remaking involves incremental construction from scratch, but in a formal space that is shot through with irregularities of titling, regulation, and governance. And in these tenement projects, rebuilding comprises a raft of efforts by residents to address gaps and secure entitlements that they should have got. So in Kanaginagar, it took residents about more than 10 years of protests, petitions, press campaigns, and partnerships with city-based housing activists and NGOs to see improvements in services. The project of formalization, thus, is complicated and undermined as resettled populations are forced to turn to informal self-provisioning as they did in their earlier slums, like by tapping into electricity lines that are not provided to them or agitating for their rights as they did in the slums. And so the story of transformation in these colonies is complex and is told in different ways, depending on gender, generation, duration of residence, etc. But all of these accounts veer between tales of amelioration and deterioration, between reports of significant improvements in living conditions over time and narratives of intractable ongoing problems that trap residents into cycles of discrimination and disadvantage. Ambivalence and duality are crucial features of the resettlement experience in India. So a resettlement colony in Mumbai, more than 10 years after being occupied, was described as somewhere between a slum and a formal city. In Kanaginagar, 18 years after the colony was founded, most residents expressed contentment with current conditions, but many pointed out that this satisfaction was founded on a comparison with past conditions and an overall resignation to lower standards of living. Several residents confessed that they would still prefer to move back to their old homes in the city slums. And for many, their goal was for their children to leave this place. Youth claimed that getting out of Kanaginagar would both give them a chance of social mobility and also indicate that they had achieved it. Nearly 2 decades after its founding then, Kanaginagar was a place of uncertain transformation, where the visible enhancement of the built space was overshadowed by the persistence of crime, safety threats, enduring stigma, and limited opportunities for socioeconomic mobility. Resettlement also produces fragmentation and difference within the neighborhood. Stigma suffuses these sites, creating internal and external boundaries. Externally, that is, in public discourse, they remain slums filled with thieves and drunkards. That's the image. A reputation that blocks youth from obtaining white-collar jobs nearby. To state service providers, the residents are undeserving recipients of free or subsidized housing, incapable of bettering themselves. And internal lines of social difference within the resettled population are exacerbated by differences in the types of housing, levels of infrastructure, and compensation packages under which people are resettled. So it's a kind of a mix of different types within a colony. Thus, seen through an extended time frame of remaking urban space and lives at the margins, resettlement emerges as an anomalous process. Scholars have captured these double-edged effects through terms like marginalized formalization that index both the recognition and rights of residents implied by their new formal relationship with the state, and the discriminatory experiences and everyday costs that this relationship entails. And Anand and Rademacher's notion of graduated citizenship talks both about the incompleteness of the their rights to the city, but also the internal differences that result from the uneven distribution of resettlement compensation and the varied positioning of subjects vis-a-vis its benefits. So, scholarship on peripheral resettlement has remained empirical, case-based, or at best, comparative. I'm attempting here to build a conceptual understanding of the phenomenon and to explore the implications of the empirical findings discussed above for concepts like marginality, citizenship, and state-society relations. To start with, I propose that resettlement is a specific form of urban marginality, distinct from familiar social-spatial forms like the slum or the unauthorized settlement. Marginalization here is not produced in the first instance by neglect, abandonment, or policy failure, but by the expansion of inclusionary state policies aimed at formalizing excluded populations and providing them a substantial welfare good. How does this policy intent yield outcomes that amount to structural violence? First, the modes through which formalization is operationalized in these marginal spaces renders it an incomplete and contradictory process undercut by and actively producing informalities of various kinds. Multiple and often contradictory motives drive the agenda of resettlement. For example, imperatives of reclaiming public lands for urban infrastructure take precedence over, in practice, take precedence over goals of improving the housing conditions of slum dwellers. So pressures to clear slums within urgent timelines lead to compromises in norms and standards. forcing residents into informal self-provisioning. In addition, the mass scale of these projects, the heavy state subsidies involved, and an underlying official ambivalence over whether the benefit delivered is a public or a private good also undermines policy objectives of inclusion. The task of conceptualizing then also calls for going beyond lived experience and locating resettlement in the political economy of contemporary urbanization in India. And I take a cue here from Wacon's analysis of neighborhoods of relegation in the post-industrial Western metropolis, like in Chicago's ghettos and the Paris banlieue of the 1980s and 90s. Wacon's concept of relegation trains focus not on these denigrated people or places, but on what he calls new regimes of advanced marginality that are actively crafted by state policies and rooted in what he calls the deep structures of financialized capitalism. In India, resettlement must be understood as the flip side of the world-class city-making agenda, the condition of its possibility. The resettlement colony then is a crucial node in a politics of capitalist spatial restructuring based on a differential valorization of places and people, which relegates housing for the poor to peripheral zones marked by the lowest valued lands. So seen from the logics of state policy focused on urban restructuring, then resettlement, I argue, embodies an agenda of differential inclusion and incorporation of excluded population into the urban polity on formally unequal terms. It represents what Latour calls a settlement, that is a compact between a newly resolute and institutionally empowered bulldozer state intent on reclaiming urban land for projects of accumulation, and the property-less but politicized masses of urban India. So it's a compact in this sense. Analyzing Mumbai's slum development schemes along these lines, Anand and Radhamaka argue that the partial citizenship entitlements that squatters have won over time through struggle and political negotiations have now given way to a politics of compensation in which they now compete for better terms of compensation. This has led to a condition in which, I quote from them, inclusion has supplanted equality as a guiding aspiration for urban development, close quotes. I argue that state-sponsored resettlement in substandard colonies enacts a tiered inclusion that diverts the goal of equality and produces graduated, conditional, or incremental citizenship. So understanding resettlement as a form of differential inclusion driven by neoliberal urban transformation on the one hand, and the need for political appeasement of excluded subaltern groups on the other, may explain the dynamics of peripheralization, but does not fully account for the ongoing production of discrimination and disconnection in these sites. For this, I turn to anthropological analyses of the social production of indifference in state practice. So I'm saying that differential inclusion is held in place and made possible by routinized everyday practices of bureaucratic indifference. You see, Hertzfeld analyzed indifference as produced through encounters between state bureaucrats and their clients, which mobilize categories of difference, building and deploying stereotypes of us and them, and their flip side, attitudes of indifference. Akhil Gupta invokes indifference to explain why India's vast package of welfare policies that were built on ethics of care and inclusion yield outcomes that are arbitrary and often violent. In his analysis, bureaucratic indifference is built into mundane routines of rule, where discriminatory outcomes are not produced by indifferent attitudes of state functionaries, but by bureaucratic pressures of getting things done that constrain even the most sincere functionary. So in resettlement colonies, then, bureaucratic indifference is as manifested in the undercompliance of state agencies with service norms and standards, emerges from the pressures of resettling and serving large numbers of surplus urban households on urgent timelines. But it also aligns with structural axes of discrimination such as class, ethnicity, caste, and gender, thus mapping onto the social status of these undeserving objects of state largesse. And of course, it is also shaped by specific fault lines in a given time and place. For example, resettlement practices in Mumbai in the 1990s, as Sapna Doshi shows, were shaped by the growing grip of real estate developers and a new xenophobic anti-Muslim ethos of the Shiv Sena party that had won power in the state. So the production of marginality of people or of spaces thus begins actually long before displacement is even conceived. And resettlement does not begin and end with a project. It is part of a sort of a larger arc of the production of marginality. So I'm going to conclude here. I've tried to characterize urban resettlement in India as a specific mode of marginalization that builds inclusion through the differential incorporation of propertyless or surplus populations into the metropolitan territory, producing a tiered urban order. Oof, I keep touching that, sorry. Why does this framing matter and what does it imply for politics and policy? First, positing a singular phenomenon with common effects across varied spatial and governance contexts urges against the assumption that these outcomes are attributable to poor implementation of particular projects. While specific aspects of implementation like distance, design, the adequacy and quality of everyday amenities can determine outcomes to some degree, it is a fundamental structure of peripheral resettlement as a strategy of unequal inclusion that really is at stake, both I think politically and intellectually. In fact, this form of resettlement is locally characterized as a new urban untouchability because it spatially concentrates the most marginal social groups in distant locations with substandard living conditions. So it's a way of structuring the city kind of on caste lines. Yet the anomalous and open-ended trajectories of transformation in these settlements points to openings and opportunities for remaking these spaces in different ways. Here again, details matter. Decent transport, schooling, and healthcare facilities hold potential for altering the dynamics of placemaking in these sites. And finally, my last point is that the role of bureaucratic indifference and its social mappings in producing the marginality of resettlement, resettled population calls for greater attention, both, I think, in scholarship and in practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen, for this very interesting presentation. You've raised many points for discussion and reflection, and I would now like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? I don't see questions in the chat, but you are free to just unmute yourself and ask the question to Karen directly. Are there any questions? Yes, Andy, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is really, really incredible and interesting, important research. I wanted to ask you a little bit whether in your connections with other parts of the world, you can see similar patterns outside of the context that you're familiar with. I mean, when I listen to what you're talking about, and I think about, well, not only in the global south, but also in the global north, the way these kind of housing projects are, different, but similar kind of questions come up. I wonder if you could say something about other parts of the world and that you might be familiar with or have spoken or conversed with people. And so I was interested about whether this is it particular to the context, or are there actually some universal aspects here, not only in the global south, but maybe in the global north as well, but perhaps not so acute. So interested in your thoughts on that. But thank you very much. It's a fantastic, interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for that question. I think that's actually I mean, it is something that I have been thinking about lately. I did do one piece of research with scholars from South Africa, and their conditions are quite similar. Johannesburg, they're talking about projects of this kind, again, being located on the sort of in a peripheral zone. And I think the dynamics that we're talking about are quite similar. I think the details are different, the sort of project design, intent, things like that. But I also, in the process of publishing a piece in the International Journal of Housing Policy on this topic, looked up, this kind of thing in other countries, and did find, actually, surprisingly, that there's a very similar dynamic happening across several countries in Latin America and South Africa, and several countries of Latin America and Africa. But I have to say that it's largely a metropolitan problem. It's not so much in smaller towns, because the issue really here is about a certain sort of commodification and financialization of land, and the moving of people to lower valued lands. And I think in that sense, the dynamic probably is reproduced in countries of the global north. But in the global north, I think about the two examples that Wacon has analyzed in great detail in his book. I think, what is it called? Urban Mud. I can't remember the name of Louis Wacon's book. So you think about the ghettos of Chicago and Baltimore, etc. Now, these are very much within the city, right? They're like inner city, but they produce very similar effects. And then you think about the banlieue of Paris, which are outside. Both of those actually, like I said, if Chicago, you don't have the physical or geographic disconnection, but you have a lot of the other effects that happen. And in Paris, with these, these towns on the outskirts, much better living conditions, much better infrastructure. I mean, I've gone and visited those places, and I'm actually astounded. I mean, they have theaters and libraries and things like that. So I think, in a sense, the kind of marginalities that are produced here are seen in other places too. But those projects are, some of those projects are in the process of being dismantled. Like you're talking in the US about breaking down these ghettos and distributing people into other. But in India, they are being rolled out. I mean, this is the future now, the way that, this is the model through which we are going to be doing low-income, affordable housing. And this is the future even in a lot of other cities of the global south, metropolitan transformation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I see two hands, one Jacob and then Christiana. Jacob.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk, Karen. My name is Jacob. I'm from Roskilde University in Denmark. I was intrigued by your term or this reflection on de-urbanization that many of the residents in these resettlements express. And I was thinking, does that challenge us to theoretically rethink the urban? If these places that, at least in their material form, resemble something that we've recognized as urban for decades, and the way we've been talking about ghettos and other, they've been included as part of the urban. Does this then provoke us to think theoretically different about what is the urban if these spaces that resemble classic urban settlements are experienced as something outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, I think, I mean, it's a fantastic question. I think the whole question is, I mean, as a lot of urban scholars now have been looking at, is how do you think about the urban? The urban is not the city. The urban is not bounded within the sort of, the sort of municipalities or governance structures of cities. but in some ways it is about urbanism, right? Ways of being urban, ways of feeling urban, but it's also about flows and connections and thickness of exchanges and all of that. And in that sense, this idea of feeling de-urbanized, of being removed from the flows and the connections and the sort of mainstream, let's say, feels like sort of a real disadvantage, real dispossession, being actually taken out of this. If you look at particularly for low-income communities where getting into the urban stream was their pathway to advancement, the pathway to the future, the pathway for their children's futures, and they're taken out of that and de-urbanized. So it's partly spatial, but it's partly also the question of disconnection through different means. Yes, and so you have a very urban landscape, but in so many different ways that has been de-urbanized.
Thanks a lot.
Christiana?
Yeah, hi. Yes, my name is Christiana. I am a geographer. I'm from Italy, but I'm currently working at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Thank you so much. I really enjoy your talk. And I made lots of notes in terms of the conceptualization of resettlement. I have questions about the aesthetics of the resettlement. As someone who's done research on urban development myself in India, I can relate much of what I've researched to what you were describing. And I remember when I was doing research in the informal settlement in Delhi, when I was talking with some of the people living in this informal settlement, and we were looking at some of these new resettlement with towering buildings and multi-story buildings, and the people there were saying we're never going to live there in these one above another with this. There was something about the verticality of these buildings, something about the aesthetics of this building that really did not fit into the social and cultural, how can I say, the social culture conceptualization and experiences of these young people. So now you talked about these, dull and reproducing this aesthetic of resettlement all across India from sort of a development, from developer and state perspective. But I was interested to know if you could talk a bit about how the people living in the formal settlement and relocating to this resettlement in terms of the social and cultural aspects of living into this multi-story. I was really struck by this idea of I'm not going to live one above another, the idea of this verticality and the aesthetics of these buildings. So I just wonder if you could say a bit about this.
Yeah, they find them very alienating, actually. I mean, especially when they have come from informal settlements, which, as you know, I mean, incrementally start from huts. So from the hut, there's an incremental building up of a brick house with a little bit of land around and a particular sort of a spatial social relationship that occurs. And a lot of it is to do with spillovers into the front yard, into the floor above, because they accommodate the new generation of their children, whatever, or the goats and the chickens and the drying of food that they do, or drying of fish, or like all of these house-based informal activities. And so the home for low-income communities is also the workspace in many, many ways, particularly for women. And that, of course, requires a particular kind of spatial flexibility. And the one thing that really struck us in Kandagi Nagar when we first started working there was that, first of all, they asked 2 houses to share a bathroom, which is just like people could not do that, even though, you know, they may have been used to community bathrooms, but like private bathrooms, 2 household sharing, no. So people sold and went. But secondly, you know, the houses were so small that even for 4 or 5 people to sleep inside, it was too cramped. And you did not have a spillover veranda or a, you know, like in a lot of informal settlements, people actually sleep on the, almost like on the street in front of the house, because it's cooler in the hot Chennai summers, or in, you know, things like that. People use the space around the house for everything, storage, sleeping, whatever. But here you don't have that space around the house. So it is really very cramped. So that's one thing. And then being this close to people that they don't know. So that's why I think that whole neighbors were strangers, because of the way that they're resettled, not as a whole community being put in one place together, but like they mix them up, which makes them feel very alienated from that space. So it takes a very long time for them to get used to this idea of living in these kinds of places. So in some ways, I've heard some young people talk about concrete buildings being aspirational, as contrasting with their little huts or whatever, that, you know, put us in a building, particularly because Chennai is very flood prone. So if you're living on the first floor or the second floor, you may not, you know, get you know, flooded as often as if you were living in a hut. But the way the design and the sort of the very insensitive design in which these things are built, and you saw that, has been really problematic. And then I just have to mention a last point, and this is not just about aesthetics and alienation, it's also about health, because there's been an excellent study done in Mumbai, Pardesi et al., which really has shown that the incidence of TB is increasing. So one of the pictures I showed in this thing really show that there's no light, no sunlight comes into these houses at all in some of the more crowded ones. And therefore, there's a higher incidence of tuberculosis that they found in a study in these resettlement colonies.
Which reference was that, Karen?
Pardesi et al.
Pardesi.
Pardesi.
Okay.
I can send it to you, Maartje.
Great. Yeah, that would be great.
Great study. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Any more questions? Because I have a few.
Of you.
Yeah, now let me ask that question. Because you talk about sites and services, and also in your article in the International Journal of Housing Policy, when you refer to Owens et al., you mentioned that sites and services projects in Chennai have now evolved into thriving and inclusive neighborhoods. And I know it myself because I've done research in one of these sites and services schemes, in Ambedkar Nagar. And thereby you seem to make a claim for reintroducing these schemes. Is that true? And then my follow-up question would be, how could that be done when the basic problems that rendered them unsuccessful, namely the location of land and the legalization issues, are still not addressed? In other words, what needs to be addressed in order to reintroduce this concept of provision of plots that can be incrementally developed so that it could work as an alternative to the provision of apartments in high-rise buildings?
So you're saying what needs to be fixed in order to do that?
Yeah. Do you believe? Are you claiming for reintroduction of the sites and services schemes? And then how would that work? Because the access to land is still a problem. The slum board says there is no land in the city center, so they have to be moved, and then you still have that problem.
So that's the part that I critique a lot, because the whole idea is that there is this commodification and financialization of land to the point where land is only made available for particular kinds of projects of urban accumulation and capitalist accumulation. And that's my fundamental critique of these projects. So, you know, it's not about saying we should do it this way. It's about saying resettlement represents that problem, that you have no place for anybody but, you know, like the sort of people with a lot of capital, because land has been transformed into this financialized asset. So that's the one thing. So it's not that there is no land. It is that there is an unwillingness to allocate land to these projects. So one of the ways in which they made the sites and services possible in the 1980s was that they acquired land for housing. And that still remains a way that you can take land out of the market and allocate it for social purposes such as affordable housing. But there are other reasons why I think the sites and services would work better. One is because they are not single caste, they were not sort of single class ghettos. They were mixed, they were integrated. The sites and services projects were conceived as mixed class neighborhoods. So you had in the same site, you had housing for middle class and lower income and what they call EWS, the poorest, all within one site with one governance structure, with parks, playgrounds, all in common, and they had sort of industrial spaces, commercial spaces within the site. That was very critical. The second thing is that they were designed in such a way that they were integrated into sort of trunk infrastructure from the get-go. So they were built in places where there was already water and sanitation lines, electricity lines, etc., even though they were on the edges. So these were planned to be integrated projects, whereas these resettlement colonies are really zones of relegation. They're like, so far outside. And, for instance, if they had made sure that these places are integrated before settling people in them, so you build this and you make sure that they have fantastic transport, water and sanitation, everything in place, and you put people in there, then my critique would not fully obtain, but that's not what is happening. What is happening is that they are, like I said before, ruralized. They're taken out of the municipal service grid and put outside.
Yeah, that was also the case with Ambedkar Nagar. That was outside the city, but it's now part of the city because it was then considered like 10 kilometers from the city center, very far off, isolated, but it's now very much integrated into the city. So it's really a government choice, you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that's where I'm talking about indifference and differential inclusion, is that when you say you are including and formalizing, but it is with second-class standards. Like they get, bad transport, they get the bad water, they get the bad everything, but they're getting a house and they should be grateful for it.
Yeah, then a follow-up question, because I was with ADB a couple of weeks ago in Manila, and there they shared with me, because this senior planner had just come back from Chennai, and he was sharing a presentation with me that they're now really going for even more resettlements with World Bank in all the cities in Tamil Nadu. So he was talking about houses that are 50 years old that need to be replaced because they want to go high-rise, and all these people need to be resettled. So this is really a scary development. How do you see this?
I mean, this book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. There's also Everybody Loves a Good Construction Project. So construction projects in India, like large-scale construction projects, are pork barrel politics. Basically, politicians love them and developers love them, and you get to pour a lot of concrete, etc. So you get to take city lands back, and you get to build a lot of housing. I mean, just producing a lot of new housing units has become a way that a lot of people are being enriched. So, as I said, this is the problematic that I'm trying to deal with. It is seen as the most progressive, inclusionary. We are, like I said, it's the condition of possibility to make the world-class city. You get to remove all of the slums and throw them out. You get to say we are building housing on the outskirts. It's a lot of construction, which is making a lot of people happy, meaning a lot of sort of the governing class happy. Yeah. And but it produces the set of problems that I have sketched in this talk.
Yeah. Yeah, and then linked to that more regarding the policy. So you were a member of this housing and habitat policy of the government of Tamil Nadu. You were part of the drafting committee. So what is your experience in that? Was there really a scope for you to express your concerns, and did they listen to you? And because there was a lot of criticism about lack of community engagement in the whole process by IRC, DUC, etc. So, to what extent were you really able to influence the drafting of this policy? What are your main criticisms, and what are the positive elements, if any?
Maartje, that's a really interesting question. I mean, that thereby hangs a long story. The version that I got to be involved in was the fourth version. So there were like three policies that were written and abandoned because there was a change of regime, there was changes of consultants and all of that. So the one that you're talking about, where I was part of the people who criticized that there was no consultation, etc., was the third version. And then the new government came in and they threw away all of the other three versions and said, let's draft a new one. And I was brought onto the committee. And of course, because for reasons, I would say gender reasons, I ended up being the drafting, because there's a lot of like older men who will give their opinions but won't write anything. And so they said, can you write it? And I took that as the opportunity to write what I wanted.
Of course.
So I basically wrote in a lot of things that I wanted to put in. And it seemed, I mean, I didn't know. So the process of how it goes through is not very transparent. People take it from you, they look at it, they say it's very interesting, and they say, we'll get back to you. And I thought that a lot of those things would be dropped. But in the version that is now circulating as the sort of notified draft, everything that I've said is in there, which is great, which is where I've talked against verticalization, against resettlement. So I even quote the Pardesi study and talk about, health problems with this. And so right now, this draft that they've, let me draft is circulating, and I don't know what will happen, whether it'll be the final notified version or not. I mean, it goes into a black box once you submit it. And it's being discussed in the circle, in the sort of political circles. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I had a lot more chance to actually draft this one than the other versions that you were talking.
But is the policy not out now? I thought the policy was out, or is it still under drafting?
It's only a draft is out.
Okay, that's still the draft. Okay,
a draft is out for.
Okay,
I think it's out for comment. I mean, this is the thing. I've been writing saying, where is the draft, and then they sent me something. And I don't know whether that is out in the public yet.
Okay.
It's circulating, I think, within the government right now.
Okay, but it's not approved yet. Okay, good to know.
It's a much better version than before, because it has all of the things that we've been asking for a long time, and we'll see.
Yeah, because it talks about resettlement close to sites, so that is a very positive thing.
Yeah,
but that really don't happen.
I'll send you the latest version.
That would be great. That would be great. Thanks. Yeah, I saw a question in the chat from Catriona. Could you ask Karen, because she cannot come with her camera mic on? Could you ask Karen if she could say something about the strength of social networks in the original informal settlements and how these are affected after resettlement? Do you know anything about the role of online social media in maintaining these networks despite being spatially separated?
So I don't know if I would talk about them as social networks, but I mean, I think I look at it more as a sense of community. And while I expect that there were a lot of young people in these informal settlements that were part of social networks of different kinds, I must say that I haven't studied that very much. But in resettlement colonies, much of that tends to break down. It's because, like I said, in Kanagi Nagar, for instance, 90 different slums are put in there and are scattered across this vast space. So people are not really sort of living close to people that they have known for a long time. And there's a lot of sort of mistrust of the people that they live next to. Now, I think over time, things do develop. And I think there's a lot of investment in building community in Kanaginagar by NGOs, by sort of even corporate bodies, etc. People are putting a lot of money, time, and effort into trying to sort of, build different kinds of social infrastructure in these places. So things like the Boys and Girls Clubs, social sports clubs, and things like that. So I think there is a rebuilding of social networks. A lot of it is actually also online, because so one of the big sponsors of rebuilding in Kanaginagar has been Hindustan Computers Limited, HCL, which is a big computer corporate. So they're bringing in computers and things like that. So there's a lot of sort of corporate social responsibility investments, etc., in these places, and things are slowly, the dots are getting connected. There is even a little bit more opportunity for youth. Young people are starting to, take on like white collar jobs, like computer. There's a lot of computer learning, etc. So those things are building up. But as I said, it's taken a long time, about 18 to 20 years. And I think there's still quite a strong ceiling where if you come from Kanaginagar, then you only get that far in terms of being part of the urban mainstream. But as I said, I think it's a sort of there's an ambivalence and an anomalous sort of, it's like things are improving, on the other hand, they're not. I mean, there are aspects in which they're getting better and aspects in which they stay the same or get worse.
Okay, there's another question, thanks Karen, which asks, could you say a bit more about how people facilitate self-provisioning? What are the mechanics of that? How do people find the resources to manage that? It's from Sarah.
Okay, so self-provisioning, what I was talking about when I talked about it in the talk, is to do with when they don't get water or electricity or those things, then they just take them, right? So you see, that's actually a really good question, because if you go into a place like, and Maartje, you would know this, if you go into Semencheri or Kanaginagar today, those houses were not, even though they're like 3 stories, 4 stories, they were not built with running water in the houses. I mean, this is really telling, right? The state is building resettlement housing. They do not provide in-house running water. And so you will see in every house a pipe that runs down the side of the house to a large blue drum below, into which water is poured, and people put a pump there and pump the water up to their houses. That's a form of self-provisioning that people have had to engage in because in-house water was not provided. For 10 years, they did not have formal electricity connections. So people just tapped into the electricity lines. And of course, then they're criminalized, and the authorities come in and cut the thing and, say that they're stealing electricity, but you have put them in houses without electricity. So the state also kind of looks at it as, there's this sort of look the other way kind of thing. When we want to, we'll come in and cut it, but most of the time we'll look the other way. And it's only in 10 years later, in 2010, 2011, that they finally came in and put formal electricity connections for them. So this is what I mean by self-provisioning, is when the basic amenities are not provided, people get them one way or another, informally, which then really undercuts the formalization of these places. Does that answer the question, or was there something else to that? Is that what you? Okay.
Yes, thank you. You've answered my question.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
Okay, great. Are there any questions that you still want to ask? I'm looking at the time. We're almost running out of time. So if there is one small, short question, then please raise your hand or open your mic. Otherwise, I have one short final question, because I want to thank you very much, Karen, for this very interesting talk, and want to thank everybody for their interesting questions. It was great. But one final question, because all in all, it's quite depressing, the whole scenario. And there was a question about, do you see what's happening in other countries? I've come from in Manila. You see also people being resettled too far off outside the city. In Bangladesh, you see the same. You see this in many countries. This same phenomenon happening. But do you see any hope for a future for real inclusion of the urban poor in the city, with these increasing land prices, the role of the private sector, the choices that the government makes, the international forces? Do you see any scope for, or what is required to make this happen? Or yeah, is there any future, and how, or do we need a revolution? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, Maartje. I mean, hope in the resettlement colonies, yes, there is hope there, because people do struggle, have struggled, and will struggle, and through their struggles, they have and will improve their conditions, and that's a given. Things, you know, they improve things wherever they are, and I've seen that in all of these places. And the way that they do it is by, you know, basically confronting the government on these things. And I think that is the way forward everywhere. Without mobilization, protest, without people really, you know, without social movements, which are, you know, often increasingly seen as disruptive and all of this, without that, the hope that you're talking about cannot happen. Because as long as you let the ruling classes get away with what they're doing, they will remain that way. But there's a lot of hope. I mean, I'm working on a project now in Ennore, where the fishers are fighting to save their wetlands from complete destruction. Over the last 30 years, they've been destroyed. But they have turned things around. They have stopped lands being, you know, taken over for ports and things like that. So these things are actually happening. So as long as, and I think as academics and as policymakers, etc., if we start to really recognize that it is in the struggles of people, that we need to take them much more seriously. We need to enable support and put, I think, all our energies behind supporting those struggles of people. Change happen. I mean, it's the only way that change can happen. There is no other way. We don't have well-meaning ruling classes that are going to change things. That, I mean, every nice design for improving the urban is always an appropriation of space from the vulnerable people. So I think it's only in the sort of struggle of vulnerable people to reclaim in small ways. It doesn't have to be, as you were saying, the revolution, I think, but in little ways, just saying no, you know, is, I know that's a hard way, but it does produce small, and we have seen small and maybe disconnected places where capital has not been able to prevail.
Yeah, so supporting bottom-up approaches and also make them visible.
Yeah, and taking them very seriously, because we don't take people's knowledge and people's struggles very seriously, actually.
Yeah.
We, you know, we devalue them.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. It was very nice to connect and to see you again and to listen to you. And thanks a lot to everybody. I would now like to hand the floor over to Sarah for the final words.
I just want to thank everybody too, because I think it's been a really interesting engagement in the conversation. Thank you. And thank you so much, Maartje.
Yeah, thanks so much from EADI as well to you, Karen. We appreciate your time and for sharing your work with us, and Maartje, of course, for chairing us and guiding us through the session. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for attending and asking interesting questions. Watch out for the recording of the session on YouTube, and we hope to see you all again at another event. So have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.